All right, so as I said, we're going to look at what determines whether or not something is living or not. And so specifically, what we're looking for are those characteristics that you would define or associate belong belonging with living organisms. So some people would say, well, let's go with movement. Well, if you look at the picture on the left of the fungi, the mushrooms, mushrooms don't move. You may see new mushrooms that are growing, but they don't move. Conversely, look at a fire on the right, it does move. Maybe you say, well, it has to eat. All right, well, do you see fungi eating anything? No. They grow on material, they grow on dead stuff, they absorb their nutrients from it, so you can't really see them eating. Conversely, a fire, you can see it consuming things as it goes. Well, it needs oxygen. Well, both of these organisms need oxygen. They give off waste. Well, both of these things produce waste items. So when you look at the characteristics, I do this just to illustrate a point. A fire is not alive. You and I both know that. You're educated enough to understand that. But sometimes, and again, this kind of ties back in with what we looked at with regard to pseudoscience, sometimes people can try to convince you of something even though you know that it can't be accurate. So you know that fires are not alive, but it has some of the criteria, or meets some of the criteria associated with living things. Now, when you look at the history of being able to identify things as being alive or not, it started with a guy that you probably should be familiar with, whose name is Aristotle. And he came up with this idea called spontaneous generation. And basically, what it said was if you have some non living material, and again, it has to be the right material under the right settings, that non living material can give rise to something that's alive. And the example that I have on here in terms of bread being left on the counter, that's one example. If you leave bread on the counter, you know bread is not living, but it gives rise to a living organism. Now, again, keep in mind that organism isn't moving. You can't really actively see it reproducing and things like that, but those are all things that it is doing. And so by definition, it met Aristotle's criteria of spontaneous generation. There are lots of examples of that. If you leave a piece of meat out on the counter or outside or something in some environment over a period of time, you'll notice that the piece of meat will get smaller and smaller. The number of maggots on that piece of meat will get greater and greater. And so at that time period, again, in Aristotle's time period, it made sense to people that that meat was converted into maggots. Same thing with, again, back in the time period, they used to keep bags of rice. That was their grain and their main foodstuffs. And with those things sitting in their homes, over a period of time, you'd notice that the amount of rice goes down, but when you get into that bag, there'd be lots and lots of mice that would come out of it. And so their theory was, well, some of that rice got converted or changed into, became mice. And so that's where this idea of spontaneous generation really began. Not necessarily all that accurate, but an interesting idea nonetheless. All right? So when we look at characteristics of living things today, you could make a very, very lengthy list. So we only have a few things on here. Obviously, when you look at living things, they are organized. You're going to typically start with DNA, some type of genetic material. That DNA is going to organize things into cells. Those cells are going to have specific organelles that we'll look at in later chapters. You're going to have organs and organ systems and so on and so forth, all very important and very necessary in terms of things being alive. Living things can reproduce, whether sexually or asexually. That will vary depending upon the type of organism, where they're found, how they survive. All of those things are key pieces of information that you really need to know to determine how it's going to be able to survive. Living things change over a period of time. Almost all living things change, whether they just simply get larger through growth, basically through asexual reproduction, mitosis, and things like that, or whether literally they undergo some type of metamorphosis, kind of like your insects and things like that. Again, other characteristics, they have the ability to adjust to the environment. I wish I could tie it into this, and I could probably figure out how if I were a little smarter. But you've all seen those computer tricks where you'll have something that you're supposed to be staring at intently, and you're just expecting it to do this and do this and do this, and all of a sudden somebody puts a scary face or something on there, and you jump. That is a response to our environment. We are looking for something, and all of a sudden, boom, something different happens, and maybe your heart is racing, maybe you jump, maybe you even physically yell. Those are a response. We do that. Our body does that so that we're ready to adjust or ready to take on whatever may be coming. And so maybe it's the fight or flight thing, whatever it might be. Body does a lot of different things that are very, very good. Regardless of what's happening, keep in mind that we as human beings, we want to keep everything as even as possible. And you say, well, now wait a second, you just said we do these things for fight or flight or whatever. That's right, so that we can stay alive. Fight or flight allows us to live. That's the idea behind it. Regardless, whether you look at sweating or you look at breathing faster or whatever it might be, we do these things to maintain that stable level as much as possible, to maintain that balance or that steady state. Very, very important idea. Living things have the ability to adapt. The example that I have on here, can you imagine putting this cat in a very cool climate? Now you can imagine that this cat probably wouldn't fare very well. Now maybe this cat has some long buried trait that allows it to be able to grow hair. And when we put it in that cold environment, that gene gets turned on and it grows lots of hair. That would be an example of an adaptation. Something that it has that's going to allow it to be able to survive better than something else. All right? Now, as we look scientifically, that's the important part in terms of my question here, which the following statements is correct, which we want to look at this from a scientific standpoint. So I wouldn't have seen it if I didn't believe it, or I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it. Here's the important thing. Scientifically, you cannot go into an experiment, you cannot go into any type of scientific study thinking you know what's going to happen. Right? That's going to be very, very key, because again, if we think we are going to see something, we may adjust our results. Maybe unconsciously or maybe unintentionally, we may adjust those results, and it affects what we end up seeing. Right? So scientifically, you can't be biased. So from a scientific standpoint, the second one, this one right here, is much, much better. We saw it. We observed it. Again, you'll remember back, one of the key components scientifically is observation. I saw it, so therefore I'm going to be able to believe it. And if I saw it, if more importantly, I can reproduce it, I can show it to someone else who then also can believe it and understand it as well.